Hello and welcome to another Shadowshaper Duels video. In today's video I'm going to be going through the human cards in a similar way that I've done previously with the Fallen. So I will go through every human card that there is currently in the game, give my opinion on them, and then as you can see I have already built a deck using the human cards, and we will take that deck into some games and see how it holds up. And then finally I will close out the video with some thoughts. Just to start off by talking about the humans, I think most of the human cards, and certainly the ones in this deck, you start unlocking very early on. Either some of them may just be unlocked by default, or you will start unlocking them from dueling the various people in either Haven or Changji Metro. There are a couple of human cards I have in my deck that you unlock a bit higher leveled, although I don't think they are critical to the deck. And where they are, I will call them out. But the reason why I wanted to include them was just to show you, how a strong human deck could look when you have access to most of the human cards. I will also add that unlike some of the other races in the game, like with the Hive and the Fallen, a lot of the human cards don't really have a single identity that they play towards. There are certainly some of them, in fact a lot of the cards that you unlock from Janshi Metro have a certain playstyle which synergizes together, and that is actually the purpose of the deck I built today. But there are a lot of human cards which just have special effects, but there's not really a sort of single playstyle that you have to use them in. So let's start off, and I will just go through every human card that I've currently unlocked, and obviously the ones I have not unlocked as well, and just give a very quick summary of them. So Ayuela is a card where when you play her on the back row, she will deal 2 damage to any card your opponent places in the front row for 2 turns. And that can also be buffed by things like a Servitor if you combine this with a Fallen deck. In my opinion, she's one of the strongest level 1 cards. In fact, you may remember I included her in my Fallen deck, just because she was a counter to the front row. So for 1 energy, although she doesn't have a lot of health herself, which if you save her for later game might mean it's difficult to play her if there are things attacking the back row, she is a very good card to play on round 1, and basically takes your opponent's front row of action for 2 rounds, unless they have some way to counter it, or the unit they're playing has more than 2 health. So I mean, you can see I've included 2 of them in my deck as well. So she is one of the better human cards, for her power. Zio is a similar to Ayuela in his behavior, apart from instead of attacking the front row, he just gains power for every unit your opponent places in the front row. So not quite as aggressive, but also definitely still has a playstyle and can act as a deterrent from your opponent putting something in the front row. He does do it for 1 turn longer than Ayuela. And if you've seen the video I made where I did the deck that was using rocks and placing them on the opponent's front row, you can certainly combine him with that playstyle, where you place rocks on your opponent's front row and in turn buff your own Zio. Then we have a rock pile which doesn't really have any special effect. I don't really need to say anything more about this. It's just a basic level 1 card. Then we have Tan, who is an exotic card you get from a Triumph. So again, with like most of the exotic cards, they have a very special purpose. Tan doubles your next power bonus. So if you have some way of giving one of your units a lot of power at once, he can be a good card to play to combine with that. But not necessarily a card you have to include in your deck, because if you're not having a deck that revolves around giving your units a lot of power, then there is not really a play for him. Tan can probably combine with another exotic card that I'll mention a little bit later on, because it gives it a lot of power. Next we have another exotic card, Ning Fei, which places a clone in the opponent's front row. The clone is sort of like an exploding shank that I discussed in the Fallen video, apart from you have to damage it yourself in order to explode the clone. It will not automatically detonate. So there are obviously 2 ways you can use that. You can combine it with another card you have that allows you to specifically target a unit, and then you shoot the clone yourself and blow it up. or you can just use it to place it in the opponent's front row and take up one of their spaces. The clone itself only has 1 power, so it's not like you're giving your opponent a huge power bonus, and it can just be a nuisance and get in their way. Again, but unless you're using a playstyle that fills up your opponent's front row, it maybe isn't needed to be included. Then we have Xur, who, I mean, he isn't human, but when you currently filter to humans, he appears in human. And Xur, when you give him a power bonus, he places a rock in the opponent's front row. It is not the same as the rock pile here. It is just a rock that has only 1 health. Again, this is a very specific playstyle. If you're playing Xur, then you're going for a rock playstyle where you're trying to fill up your opponent's front row. And then you're probably combining it with the Fallen card I previously mentioned, which gains a bonus multiplied by how many rocks are on your opponent's front row. If you are not doing that playstyle, I don't really think you include a Xur in your deck because it is a very specific playstyle. And I have previously made a video on that when I was showing how to counter the Ogre card and fill up your opponent's front row. Then we have Wu Ming, who is quite a powerful card because he will suppress a unit that your opponent has placed. And what suppress does is it both removes any bonus power that unit has been given, and it also removes whatever the special effect is. So if the unit attacks or itself gains a power bonus, it stops it from doing that. So Wu Ming is a card that you can include in basically any deck if you feel like you need to have a counter to something your opponent might play. I've not put one of them in my deck this time around, but there would be nothing wrong with including one of them in place of one of the other cards. Again, you either use him to strip a large power bonus off one of your opponent's units, or if they play something that attacks and that attacking card is going to prevent you from being able to play the card you want to play, you can just first suppress your opponent and then you're free to place cards without them being attacked. Then we have Mu Ying, and he is basically the human equivalent of a Ketch. When you play him, he summons Guerilla units on the left and on the right. Now, he is a slightly worse version than the Ketch because he only summons 2 Guerrillas in total, 1 on his left, 1 on his right, whereas the Ketch drops a total of 4 dregs, 2 on the left, 2 on the right. So he is the human equivalent of a Ketch, albeit slightly worse. Nevertheless, I've included 2 of them in my deck at the moment because I'm going for a playstyle that revolves around Guerilla units. Then we have Speaker, which is a card where when the Speaker acquires a power bonus, it grants +2 to the unit on the right. So essentially, it's a way of getting more power. If you can give the Speaker power one way or another, maybe inspire her or place her next to a Pandora, not only will she gain power, she will also give another unit power. So you're just chaining the power effect. To be honest, it's a card I've never used because I feel like it's a bit of a waste. I just want to give the unit power that I want to buff. I don't want to think about having to play it next to the Speaker and buff the Speaker first. Next we have Denzin, who is another card that revolves around the Guerilla playstyle. When acquiring a power bonus, he summons a Guerilla on the left. So he's, again, sort of like the human version of one of those Fallen Captains I previously discussed, where the Fallen Captain was when your Fallen units deal damage, it summons a Dreg. This is when he acquires a bonus, he summons a Guerilla. So yeah, he's just the human version of that captain and plays into the Guerilla playstyle. I have included the 2 of them in my deck because the playstyle I'm going for in this deck is Guerilla units. I do have one annoyance with this card, which I will mention a little bit later on, but I assume it is this way for a reason, as a counter to what I find annoying. Next we have Hyssop, again, not a human, he's an exo, but he appears in the human filter, and he is just, when played, he grants a +3 power to a unit. Now the catch here is he can only grant that to a unit who already has bonus power, so you cannot use him to buff a a unit who has not already been given a power bonus. So he should not be the first card you play to try and give a bonus. I see a lot of people playing him when they have no buffed units on their field, and it's a complete waste. But if you already have a unit with a bonus, then Hyssop will be able to give it another bonus. Useful if you're trying to trigger multiple effects on the same unit, because he does have a very low cost to play him at only 2 energy. Next we have Wolf, who I have discussed in a couple, or say included in some decks in a couple of my previous videos. He's just generally a very strong exotic card. The ability to instantly delete a high power card from your opponent's field is very good. If you are using a deck that will allow you to get more than 5 cards on the field. I've not included him in this deck, but again, I could certainly include him in place of one of the other exotic cards I've got. If I didn't have any of them unlocked. He is a very good exotic card to have. Next we have Yolda, which doubles the next instance of damage dealt. So that is a very powerful effect if you have a card that can do a lot of damage. Obviously it only doubles once, it's not a permanent double bonus. You may remember I used Yolda in my very first video where I went over the Triumph to deal 40 damage. So that's sort of the playstyle she's going for, if you want to get big damage in one attack. I've not included her in this deck because it's not a particularly damage dealing deck. But again, she certainly has a use, especially if you're going for that 40 damage Triumph. Then we have Finala, who, when played on the front row, she grants +8 power to one of your units. However, she does then gain, or I guess lose, -3 power herself. So, this is a way of giving one of your units a really big power bonus, but then, it's not a net +8 overall. It's technically only a +5 in terms of the power bonus, because she takes damage to herself. But yeah, she's still has a use in various decks, especially where you need a way of giving a buff. And I've included one of them in my deck because I do need cards in my deck that can give buffs. Finale is also the card I was alluding to when I mentioned earlier on that you could combine with Tan, because Tan doubles your next power bonus. So if you look at the energy they need to play, Tan takes 2, Finale takes 3. You could save both of these exotic cards and play them together on round 5. And then she would give a +16 power bonus because it would be doubled by Tan. Obviously, she would still take the -3, but +16 is a huge power bonus to get in one turn. Especially not on a energy level 6 card that you play right at the very end. Next we have Chinawat, who is a human unit that can give +1 power he gives it to 3 units. He gives it to one of your units and the unit on the left and the right. So if you play him, ideally you want to try and play him next to some other units where you've already got a line of them. Click one of those units in the middle, and then he can buff multiple units at the same time. I have included one of them in my deck, purposely because if there is ever a situation where I am able to play 2 of these Denzins next to each other, he will then be able to buff both of them and trigger both of their effects at the same time. So I could, again, looking at my deck very quickly, I will go over my deck fully at the end, but I could have included 2 of him, and to be honest, if I did not have Finala, then I would have probably included 2 of him. They both have the same energy cost of 3. They both need to be played on the front row, so they are very similar. The only difference is, he will buff 3 units, although it is a weaker buff at +1. She buffs a single unit for +8. So I included both of them just to, have those options. But as I said, if you didn't have a Finale, or if you wanted to use one of your exotic cards on something else, then he is a suitable alternative. Next we have Common Cover, which is a it's a high health card at 7, and when played in the front row, it randomly places 2 rocks in your opponent's front row. So similar comment to what I said when going over Zur. If you are going for the rock playstyle, then this is a pretty much must include in your deck, If you are not going down the rock playstyle, then you probably don't want to include it, unless you're including it for the 7 power. But I think there's better cards to include if you are not doing that specific playstyle. And also, it's not a human; it's an object. Next, we have Morgan, who again is not a human, is an Ahamkara, but currently shows up under the filter for humans. Morgan is another way of just giving a +1 power to a unit, and has to be played on the back row. So as you can see, I have one Morgan in my deck as well. Similar reason to Chinawat, as I was explaining. They are both ways of giving power, and the only reason why I include one of each is because one has to be played on the front row, one has to be played on the back row. So depending on if one of my rows is starting to fill up, or if my opponent has played a card that is currently preventing me from using that row, I've got options. You could very easily swap one of these cards out and have 2 of the other, but I just included one of each to have options. Next, we have the Guerilla Captain, which is when acquiring a power bonus, it deals 2 damage to a random opposing unit. So this is one of the very few human cards, especially legendary, that actually is an attacking card. There certainly could be a place to have this in my deck. However, I've decided not to do it because my deck isn't really focused on attacking. When I have the ability to place a buff, I really want to use it to spawn more Guerilla units, not to attack. And to be honest, 2 damage, it's not a huge amount. Yes, if you can buff him every turn, then it's still 2 damage every turn, but it's not a great amount of damage. So I've not included him in my deck. But if you don't have some of the cards that I have, then there is certainly you could play him in there and have an attacking option. Next, we have Donovan. Again, not a card with any special effects. The only reason you play him is because he has 6 health. So, he's a fairly high value card for a fairly cheap energy cost. But I think there's better cards to have when you start unlocking them. Next, we have Radagast, who is one of the better cards for the humans, I would say. The only downside to him is you only unlock him at rank 19 from the speaker. I have included one of them in my deck, and I know, if you're using the human cards and you're at a low rank, you probably don't have access to Radagast, but that's okay. He's not a critical part of the deck, but it's one of those where now that I have him, I may as well include him. But you could certainly do without him. Radagast's buff is if there are fallen units on your opponent's field, which, if you're still in the, I'm still matching people who are playing fallen cards, even though I'm rank 20. There's a very good chance your opponent might have 1 fallen card, even if it is just a servitor to buff their other cards. Then he will grant all gorillas in the same row he is played on +4. So that's why I have him, because the deck I've currently built is around getting gorillas. So he's a very good buff to have. He's sort of like the human version of Vanuk from the Fallen. Apart from he only buffs gorillas instead of every human unit. And also there is another exotic card, which is the human equivalent of Vanuk. But he is like a lower energy version of that with a very similar effect. Plus 7 health is a lot to play. Next we have Bezonet, who is a card you unlock at rank 15. So she's one of the higher rank human cards you unlock. And her effect is when played on the back row, she deals 3 damage to all opposing units with a bonus. So I've included one of these in my deck, although again, I don't think you have to, and because she is unlocked a bit later on, if you are making an early game human deck, you won't have access to her. But the reason for her inclusion, and the reason why I think she exists as a card, is if you are coming up against an opponent who their whole playstyle revolves around buffing buffing their own units, then you can play her later on, maybe on round 5 or on round 6, as a counter to that to do big damage. For example, if you were going second and you're against an opponent who's playing a fallen deck that uses Vanuk, after they have played Vanuk on round 6 and buffed all of their fallen by +2, you can then use Bazinet to hit them all for 3, which will just completely counter the Vanoc exotic card. So that is mainly why I have included her in my deck, just to have an option to maybe play her on round 6 if such a scenario occurs. You could also use her as a counter to Hive, because a lot of the Hive deck revolves around buffing their own units to give them the inspired effect, so she can be a good counter to that. She's one of very few human cards that actually is an attacking card, so that's why I included her. Although again, I definitely don't think she has to be included in the deck. She's just more there so that I have options. But you could replace her with something else. Next, we have Pandora. And his effect is when your turn ends, he grants the unit on the right +2 power, and this is a sustained effect. So if you play Pandora on round 4, then whatever unit is on the right of him on round 4, round 5, and round 6 gains +2 power. So actually in total, he's granting +6 power, by the end of the game. So he is a very good human card to have if you have other cards in your deck that revolve around needing to be given a buff. Coming back to a point I raised earlier, this is my one annoyance with Pandora and with Denzin, because Denzin's buff is when acquiring a power bonus, he will summon a gorilla on the left. So putting a Denzin next to a Pandora is a good idea, because Pandora will then buff Denzin. However, the gorilla will then spawn on the left of Denzin, which means the gorilla is now on the right of Pandora. So on the next round, it's not Denzin who acquires the buff to spawn another gorilla, it's the gorilla that he has just spawned. So you can only play a Pandora and a Denzin combined together for 1 round, and then it will not spawn any more gorillas. And obviously, what I said about Pandora giving the buff still applies, that gorilla will still gain bonus power, but it's a shame that you can't combine them to sort of create a chaining effect of just spawning gorillas every round. However, I suspect that is why Denzin spawns it on the left. Maybe they think it is too overpowered if it spawns gorillas on the right, and you can spawn gorillas for 3 rounds. Obviously, that would be 3 gorillas in total. But yeah, it's a shame it doesn't work that way, but I suspect that's probably why they've configured it this way. Next, we have this card here, which is just when played on the front row, it grants +2 power to a unit on the right. Essentially, this is a worse version of Pandora, because it is restricted to the front row. It does the same effect as in it buffs the unit on the right by 2, but it is not a sustained effect. It just happens for the 1 round. The only somewhat difference here is that he has 1 more health than Pandora. But in my opinion, this is just a worse version of Pandora. If you do not have Pandora, then by all means, you can use this card as a sort of placeholder until you get Pandora, just as a way of giving a buff. But as soon as you unlock Pandora, I see no reason to ever use this card, because it is just worse. Now you have Think Tank. Again, it's not a human, but it shows up in the human filtering. And the purpose of Think Tank is to deal damage to a unit equal to the highest bonus on your field. If you saw my previous video on how to get the Triumph for doing 40 damage, I used Think Tank for that. However, outside of that Triumph, I have never used him, because it is such a sort of niche playstyle of make 1 unit buffed really high and then play Think Tank to do a lot of damage, when there are other cards that do a lot of damage, such as Wolf, which just deletes a card. I have not used Think Tank outside of that build, but it clearly has a purpose because I used it to get a particular Triumph. Next, we have Lady Scory, whose effect is if there are units in the opponent's back row, it grants +5 power to the unit on the left. But this is only a one-off +5. It is not a sustained +5. Obviously, she is quite a good card to have, and if I did not have some of the cards I previously mentioned in my deck, then I could probably find a place for a Lady Scory in my deck. 7 is a lot of health, so she is already a fairly high level card, and then being able to give one other card plus 5 is a good effect. So, you know, if you have unlocked her and you don't have some of the other cards I have mentioned unlocked, she's not a bad card to play. I don't have her in my deck, but that does not mean she's a bad card. Next, we have this card here, who will deal damage to an opposing unit equal to the number of units in the opponent's back row. I'll be honest and say I have never used this card, because it just seems like a very niche effect. You know, if generally speaking, I do find opponents tend to play more cards in the back than the front because there are more cards that need to be played on the back row. But you know, that's only a maximum of 7 damage if they have filled up their back row. So it's not a lot of damage. And you know, okay, he has 8 health, but for a level 5 card, I'll be honest, I want something a little bit more. So I've never used it. Next, we have the Sparrow, which I remember using this card very early game. I think it may be one of the cards you just have unlocked by default, and if not, you certainly get it very early on. And the reason I used it is just because it's a very simple effect. You know, when played on the front row, it gains an extra 3 power. So in addition to its 7 starting power, it will gain plus 3 and it will go to 10. You should always play this on the front row. There's no reason not to. But, you know, having a card that just gives you plus 10 energy is, or should I say plus 10 power, is not a bad early game card to have. So I do remember using this card early game. It's not in my deck now because there are better things. But if you are very early game, this is a good card to use. Next, we have Kaber, who is one of the exotic human cards. And he is what I would say is the human equivalent of Vanok for the Fallen. His effect is when played, he grants all Guerilla units plus 3 power. So that is why I have Kaber in my deck, because the whole purpose of the deck I've built is to spawn Guerilla units, and then hopefully play Kaber on round 6 to buff those Guerilla units. You unlock Kaber from Wuming rank 10, so he's not super early game, but you know, rank 10 is still a low rank. So when you get to rank 10, if you have not been lucky to buy Vanok from the store, then maybe you want to look into building a human deck with Kaber instead of a Fallen deck with Vanok. Next, you have Ikora, who is another human exotic card, and in my opinion, probably one of the strongest exotic cards. I am seeing Ikora a lot now when I am at rank 20, because she just has such a strong effect. Not to mention she has 13 health anyway, which is a large power bonus to your score. And her effect is, when played, she deals 2 damage to all opposing units in one row. So that can be as many as 7 units if your opponent has filled up one of their rows. I am seeing Ikora played so many times now, and she's such a good counter to so many things. You know, if your opponent is using Vanok, and they are trying to get a lot of Fallen down, you can then just use Ikora to destroy a row completely. Generally, if your opponent is using Vanok, they're probably deploying a Ketch, and obviously the dregs from the Ketch are usually quite weak. Ikora will just destroy that row and kill the dregs. So yeah, 2 damage to up to 7 units is a big attack, and then also just having 13 health to begin with, you know, will be a huge score increase. You know, you could use Ikora to win the game and get 13 score, you know, even if you don't attack many units, just her health is that big. So yeah, I've included her in my deck just to have an attacking option on round 6. The way you get Ikora is from the triumph for collecting 40 cards. So you know, you will eventually get her from that triumph as you get a higher rank and obviously unlock more cards and buy cards from Wuming to just get more. Next, we have this card, whose effect is, when played, he will grant plus 3 power to units on the left and the right. This is another card I remember using early game. I think he he either may be a card you have by default or you get him very early on. And the reason why I had him is just because, when I didn't have anything better, he was a good card to play on round 6, because not only does he have 8 health himself, which is quite a lot, but if you can play him in between 2 units, which you should be able to do, that's an extra 6, by the +3 to both units. So in total, playing him is 14 power, assuming he buffs 2 units. So a good card to use early game, a very good, round 6 card if you don't have anything better. I'm going to skip over the War Beast because this is obviously Cabal, and I don't know why it's classed as human. So when I do a Cabal deck, I will discuss the War Beast. Next, we have Umiko. So I'm now into the cards that I have not yet unlocked. Her effect is when played on the back row, your units randomly deal 1 to 3 additional damage. So essentially, she's sort of like a servitor in the sense of buffing your units, but it's a bit of a gamble because if they own, a servitor only is +1 anyway, so at worst, it's the same as a servitor. But if you get unlucky, it's a +1 effect, so it's the same as a servitor, and you've wasted your exotic card on something a servitor could do. But if you get +3, that is a huge power bonus. The way you unlock her is by dueling this guy, who is a level 27 duelist, so she is a very late game card. And I can also say I have not yet come up against anyone playing this. I have not matched with anyone that high of a level yet. But I imagine when you get to that high level, she will probably be a good card to include in your deck, and will likely replace having servitors in your deck. Next, we have Common Cover, which I don't actually believe is a card you can obtain. I think the only reason this is here is because Common Cover is what that other legendary card spawns that I mentioned earlier, because when you click on it, it does not show a source. So I'm not really going to discuss this because it is more... I'm actually saying that, no, it isn't Common Cover, it's Rocks. So I don't know how you unlock this card. The source is missing. But even then, it's a rare card and it has no effect. I don't think it's anything really worth talking about. Then we have this exotic card here, another one I don't have. As you see, I have there's quite a few of the exotic human cards I've not yet got. His effect is when played on the back row, deal 5 damage to a unit and move it to another location on the battlefield. So for a card that you could play on round 3, that seems quite a good effect. If there is an opponent unit that has a lot of health, you can deal damage to it, and then assuming you don't kill it, move it somewhere else. And I would suggest you use that on units that need to be played in a particular place, like the front or the back row. So move it onto the row where it no longer works, and that will just disable its effect. I assume. I've never used it. But yeah, I can see a use for that if you need to, stop an opposing unit doing something. And you unlock this card from dueling someone who is level 24. So again, a late game human card, and that's why it's one I've not got yet. And I've also not yet matched anyone playing this card. Then you have Gwyn, which is when played on the front row, she deals 3 damage to a unit and the unit on the left and the right, and then she loses 2 health herself. I have matched quite a few people playing Gwyn, because that is quite a good effect. The ability to hit 3 different targets for 3 damage is quite a strong attack. Again, you can maybe use this on someone if you see them playing a lot of dregs, because you think, they maybe have a Vanok card. You can use this to kill their dregs, and reduce the number of fallen they have. The way you get Gwyn is she is a random chance drop from Gauntlet Onslaught, and I have not yet got her, but she is certainly a card you could get if you get lucky. She's not necessarily restricted to being a late game card. I've come up against level 10s playing Gwyn. Then you have Saladin, which is when one of your human units take damage, they gain +3 power. I think this will probably be a really strong inclusion in any human deck when you unlock Saladin, because essentially if someone attacks you and they don't kill your unit, then that unit will gain +3 power. In fact, it says, well, yeah, they gain power, so that unit. So if you attack a unit and don't kill it, it's then going to gain +3 power. So it's almost a deterrent from your units being attacked. The way you unlock Saladin is by challenging Saladin, who is a level 29 duelist. So a very late game card. I have not matched anyone playing this yet. But I imagine when you get to those ranks, if you want to use a human deck at those high levels, you probably want to have Saladin in your deck as a deterrent from being attacked. Next, we have Atal, who is a very simple exotic card. It just doubles the power of a unit, and this is a 6 energy card. So the idea here would be you focus your whole deck on getting one card to a very high power bonus, a very high total level, I guess. Similar to what you would do if you were playing Think Tank to attack. And then on round 6, you just double that unit. And, assuming you've got it very high, then that's a huge power bonus on round 6. She is a card that you just get from the vendor. So I did not buy her first time she was around. I will probably buy her next time she's around just to have her unlocked. Although, again, that she has a very particular play style. If you're not going down a play style of buffing one unit to a really high power, then there is probably not much of a point in playing her because you won't have anything high to buff. Next we have Estella. Her effect is she will grant a unit power equal to 2 times the number of units in your opponent's front row. So, assuming your opponent has put a lot of cards in their front row, she can apply quite a large bonus. That can be up to 14 if your opponent has fully filled their front row with 7. But even if they've, not fully filled it and they've only got maybe 5 units in, still being able to grant a unit plus 10 power is a great bonus. Combined with the fact that, just like Ikora, she also has 13 health to begin with. In fact, Estella and Ikora are the 2 highest health cards, with how much health they have themselves. So yeah, playing Estella on round 6 can be, probably a game-winning move if your opponent has put a lot of units on their front row, just because she herself will give you a large bonus, and then she will also give another unit a large bonus. The way you unlock her is from the card vendor, and I have not yet seen her for sale, and I have also not yet come across anyone playing her, but I assume she will be for sale in the next few weeks, while we are still in the current season. So I would suggest picking her up when she is available for sale, because you don't know when she will then next be on sale, and she does have quite a strong effect. So that was every human card discussed, and that took quite a while. There were quite a lot of them, 5 pages in total. So I'm now just very quickly going to go through the deck I have built, explain why I've included certain cards, although I did allude to some of them in the video, and then we will take this deck into some gameplays. Just as a sort of very a top note to play about the deck, most of these cards I have included in my deck you can unlock before rank 10, and the reason why I'm specifically saying rank 10 is because rank 10 is when you get Caber, and the whole play style of this deck is to do with Guerilla units, and really you need Caber to support that playstyle. But all of the cards that you need to do that Guerilla playstyle you will be able to unlock before rank 10. The only 2 cards I have in my deck that you unlock after rank 10 are Radagast, who, as I mentioned earlier, I have him in there almost as like an alternative to Caber. If I get unlucky and I don't get Caber, I might at least get a Radagast, and I can use him to do a very similar effect. But you don't need him in there because he's doing a similar thing to Caber. And then the other card I have in my deck, which you don't get until rank 15, is Bazinet. But she's just in there to give me an attacking option. She's not part of the Guerilla playstyle. You could certainly not include her and have other cards instead. And then there are a few cards I have in the deck which are based on triumphs rather than a particular level. So the purpose of this deck is to get as many Guerilla units on the field as possible, and then try and buff those units at the end with Caber, or with Radagast, or with both. But again, even if you don't have Radagast, you can still go down this playstyle with Caber. So that is why I included 2 Mu Yings and also 2 Denzins, because they are my 4 cards that can spawn Gorillas. I then included 2 Ayuelas just because, as I mentioned when covering her card, she's a very good level 1 card. She does a decent amount of damage and can be a deterrent from your opponent placing things on the front row. If they are doing a similar play style with Mu Ying or even with a Ketch, they won't be able to play them on the front row until Ayuela is timed out, or they will have to play them on the back row instead. So she's my level 1 card, and I included 2 of her. I then just covered these 4. They are my Guerilla spawning cards. So then the next 4 cards I have included, plus Pandora, are all cards that give me various buffs. I've included a Hyssop just because he is an energy level 2 card. He is, I believe, the only level 2 energy card that grants another card a buff. So my main reason for having him is that I don't usually play him on round 2 because I won't have anything on the field at round 2 that is worth, that can be buffed. So I usually save him if I get him for round 5, and then try and play him in combination with something else. For example, you see the next 3 cards are all energy level 3, and they are all cards that give power bonuses. So on round 5, I could play one of these cards to give my unit a power bonus, and then still have 2 energy left to play a Hyssop and give that same unit another power bonus and trigger their effect twice in the same round. And I'm specifically referring to Denzin here. I could play 2 cards and buff Denzin twice in the same round. So that's why I included him, because he's the only level 2 power card capable of giving a buff. Then the next 3 cards, I think I mentioned this when discussing each of them respectively. They are just different cards that give a power bonus and various caveats or limitations. Finala has to be played on the front row, but she gives a really big bonus. This guy also has to be played on the front row, but he can buff more than 1 unit. So if I've got 2 units that need buffing, he's a better option than Finala because he can apply to both of them. And then Morgan, technically is the weakest buff because it's only a +1 to 1 unit, but he has to be played on the back row, and he does have more starting health. So between the 3 of these, I've got various buff options. You could obviously swap in and out various numbers of these. If you find yourself, always wanting to place your buffing cards on a particular row, then double down on that row instead of 1 of each. I included Bazinet just to have an attacking option, and as I mentioned, if I come up against someone who is using a fallen playstyle with Vanuk, she's a perfect counter to that, assuming I go second, but certainly not a card you have to include. And if you are building this deck at a lower level, for example at level 10, then you won't be able to include her. If you are, rank 10 and trying to copy this deck, I would suggest just swapping her out for either another Chenowat or Morgan, just to give yourself more buffing options, increase your chance of drawing those cards. I have 1 Radagast, again, just to be able to buff my Guerilla units. He is an alternative to Caber. Maybe I get unlucky and I don't ever draw Caber, but then I can play Radagast on round 6. Or if I know I've got both, I can play Radagast on round 4 or 5 and then Caber on round 6 and buff my Guerilla units twice. But again, certainly not a card you have to include. He's a nice to have when you hit rank 19. But if you don't have Radagast, I would give the same suggestion I gave for Bazinet. Just swap in another buffing card. Or you could even swap in one of the human cards that does some damage. Maybe the Guerilla Captain or something like that, just so that you have an attacking option. Or maybe even as a second Pandora. And speaking of Pandora, I include Pandora just because it is another way of giving a buff, and it's a sustained buff. So despite the limitation I explained before, where Pandora and Denzin don't really synergize together, I still have one of them just because a sustained buff is still nice, because it will give that +2 power for multiple rounds, and I can at least combine it with Denzin once. And then finally, I have picked 2 different power level 6 cards, and I know I will never be able to play both of them at the same time, but my reason for including both is because Caber is there because I hope I am able to get multiple Guerilla units on the field and then play Caber to buff them all. However, there is a chance that either I get unlucky with the cards I draw and I've not been able to summon that many Guerrillas, or maybe my opponent has been attacking me a lot and destroying them, in which case it probably isn't worth playing Caber. If I only have 1 or 2 Guerrilla units to buff, that's not that much of a power bonus. In which case, Ikora is probably the better card to play because she just has more health anyway. If we just do the math, Caber is a 7, so I would need to buff at least 2 Guerrilla units +3 just to get to the starting health of Ikora. So any less than 2 Guerrillas, and it's not worth playing him. And then obviously Ikora deals damage to my opponent. No, obviously there's no guarantee I will draw both of these, so I may not have to pick. I may only get lucky and get one of these exotic cards, in my hand. But Ikora is there as an alternative because she has more health. She has a arguably stronger effect in being able to deal damage. And yeah, if I see that my opponent has a lot of units on one line, it may actually be more beneficial to attack them than it is to buff my own units. So I included them both just to have options. It's always better to have a backup plan in case your first plan of spawning gorillas doesn't work. So now that I have discussed the deck, let's take this into some games, and then I will just come back at the end after those games to give my final closing thoughts on the human cards. Okay, so I've just matched with a level 10 using my human deck, and they are going first. So to start off with, I'm going to just play Ioella, because she's my only level 1 power card, plus if they start spawning dregs on the front, Ioella will counter that. So I now have the choice of either playing Denzin or Mu Ying, but I'm going to play this guy here because it will spawn 2 gorillas, whereas this guy will only spawn gorillas if I have a way to give him a buff, which I can't do on this round. I'm going to play him on the back row for now, because I have a few cards that need to be played on the front row. So yeah, I'm going to keep the front row free for now. I do notice here that I do have a Radagast, so if I don't get a Caber, I can at least use Radagast to buff my gorillas. So I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play one of these guys, and then on the next turn I will probably use Finala to buff him and spawn an extra gorilla. I want to try and keep all my gorillas in the same row because Radagast only benefits in one row, not the whole field. I think I'm going to, although I could play Radagast now because he's 4 energy, I want to get this extra gorilla down first. So I'm going to play Finala on the front row and buff this guy to make an extra gorilla. I now can't play anything else in my back row because I want to save that final space for Radagast. So I'll have 3 gorillas in total. Given he has quite a few units with a power bonus, I'm going to play Radagast this turn because there's nothing else I can put on this back row. So let's play Radagast. On the off chance I get a Caber, I can still play Caber to buff them again, but if I don't, at least I played him. Oh, it was a good play on his part with Ikora. Can I do anything that will close the gap? Yes, I have my own Ikora. So, I mean, if I play Ikora, that should be an easy win. I'm going to play her on the back row because she will kill all the things with a bonus. If I hadn't have got that Ikora, I would have probably played this card to attack all of the cards with a bonus, and then this guy just to spawn some extra units. Okay, so I've just matched against another level 10, and once again I'm going second. Okay, so I do see I have a Radagast, that is always good. And I have this guy who will spawn some gorillas, so them two cards will definitely be played at some point. I'm going to do the same opening and play Ayuela. I'm probably going to have to play this guy on the back row because for the next 2 rounds the front row is not somewhere I want to play. So yeah, I think I'm going to play him on the back row. That was a mistake on his part. He should have known not to play a card with only 1 energy on the front row. Okay, noted. I have an Ikora, so I'll definitely want to use her on round 6, which means I need to make sure I use Radagast on round 4 or 5. For now, I mean, I don't have any play that really benefits me, but just to not waste the turn completely, I'm going to play Morgan and just buff one of my units. Okay, so he doesn't have any units at the moment with a buff, so there is no point in me playing this card. I think the logical play here is to play a Pandora just to start giving one of my cards a buff. Then on my next turn I can play Radagast, and then on round 6 I can play Ikora. So let's just play Pandora here. I want to play Pandora first to start, you know, this gets an extra round, whereas if I play Radagast now, I'm losing out on this +2. And now I have a Caber as well. I have 2 gorillas, although they're going to get buffed by +4, so that will give me 8. If I do 3 damage to these units, I'm not going to play Radagast. I might play Caber on round 6 to buff them. I think I'm going to use this card here just to do something different and attack all of his units with a bonus, because it should kill 2 of them. And I think that actually netted me more score than if I played Radagast. Radagast would have only given, maybe not, because the Radagast has a higher power, but I wanted to use this card. I think I could do either of these moves and it would win. If I play Caber, he'll grant +3 to both of them. If I play Ikora, I'll do some damage to him. But let's just play Caber. I'm going second anyway, so as long as I win, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so I've just matched another level 10. This time I am going first. I don't have any level 1 cards, so I've got no option here but to end my turn. But I like what I'm seeing already. I have a Radagast to buff my gorillas. I have this guy to spawn gorillas. I have this guy who can also spawn gorillas. And I have a Pandora who I can combine with this guy to make the gorillas. Let's start off with playing this guy just to get some gorillas on the field. I need to be careful not to use up my back row and save space for Radagast, but I'm going to try and get all of my gorilla cards on the back row. I'm going to play this guy for now. I have 3 spaces on the back row, When he spawns a gorilla, that will take up a space. I need to probably use Pandora to spawn the gorilla. Although I could use this, I could use Finale. I want to be careful not to. I'm going to have to not play Ayuela. I don't want to fill up the back row with non-gorilla cards. That's a shame. That's how I was going to get some more gorillas, so I could have played Ayuela after all. Okay, what do I play? I think I'm going to play Pandora just so that I at least get the next few rounds of, you know, the bonus being applied, even though he's not going to spawn gorillas now. But if I play Pandora on round 4, I at least get the benefit for 3 rounds. Okay, and I have an Ikora, which is probably going to be my play on round 6. So I think I use Radagast on this round to buff the only 2 gorillas I've got, and probably play an Ayuela as well, just while I have spare energy. It does seem a bit of a waste playing Ikora, given whatever row I play her on, she's only going to attack 2. But just the fact she gives me 13 energy anyway, it's really hard to pass that up. I don't think there's another combination of cards I could play here that would give me more than that. Finale gives quite a few, but obviously she loses her own power. These give buffs, but nowhere near as much. I think Ikora is the best play, not so much for her attacking this round, but just for how much damage she's going to put out. Well, I don't mean how much damage she's going to put out. I mean for her how much energy she has to begin with. Okay, so I've just matched with a level 10 and I'm going second. Not the strongest starting hand. I don't see a Radagast or any of my exotic cards. At least I do have ways to make gorillas. Let's start with Ayuela. Very bizarre move on my opponent's part. He played a card that we would not have been able to buff anything, and it instantly got destroyed because of where he played it. I'm going to try and make my gorillas on the front row this time, just because I'm seeing Morgan, who is a back row card, so if I play on the front row, I might get more gorillas on the front row. So let's start with this guy, just because he's the easiest way to get 2 gorillas. Very bizarre move again. He's played a card that gives a buff when he has no cards to buff. I'm going to just play my other card that spawns gorillas, so that on my next turn I can buff it. Okay. I'm going to use Morgan to buff this guy. I could use this one here, but I don't want to put more units on the front row, because if I play this smart, I will be able to buff this guy 2 more times to make more gorillas. So I don't want to risk the front row getting filled up. So I'm going to play Morgan on the back row and buff my card that'll spawn a gorilla. If I can keep all my gorillas on the same row, then if I happen to draw a Radagast instead of a Caber, it would actually be better to play Radagast. So this round, I'm going to play this card just to summon some more gorillas, but I'm going to have to play him on the back. And annoyingly, I could have played Hyssop to buff this unit, had he not just been attacked, because he now no longer has a bonus. So actually, I think what the logical play here is, I am going to have to play this on the front row to buff this guy, which will fill up the front row, but it doesn't matter. I still have room on the back row for Caber. So let's play this guy and buff my card. That'll spawn another Guerilla. I've now managed to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Guerilla units down. So this will be a very big buff by Caber on the last row. And I don't get Radagast anyway, so it's not like I've filled up the front row for a bad reason. Yeah, the obvious play here is to play Caber and buff all of these Guerrillas. So I've just matched against a level 10 and I'm going first. I don't have any cards that only take 1 energy, so I'm going to have to skip my first turn. But this already looks like a very strong starting hand. I have both Ikora and Caber, so I've got my attacking and my more passive card for round 6, whichever one is most applicable. And I have some units that will be able to spawn Gorillas. I'm going to play my Gorillas on the back row this time. Because the one card I see I have that can spawn Gorillas, I have to play on the front row. So if I can make the Gorillas on the back row and use the front row as my row for playing the buff cards. Okay. I mean, the obvious play is just to play this guy again. I want to get as many Gorillas as possible. That does now mean the back row is now... Well, it's not filled up, but there would be no point in me playing one of these guys on the back row because he wouldn't have nowhere to spawn it. So I'm going to play one of these on the front row. And I may as well just fill up the back row with Ayuela because I have spare energy and space. What is going to be great about this next round is it's round 5, and I'm going to be able to play another one of these guys, a Denzin, as well as a Chinawat, and that will get me 2 more Gorillas on the front row. I could obviously use Pandora to provide a buff, but Pandora is only going to give me 1 Gorilla, whereas doing it this way, I will get 2. And I think given how many Gorillas I've managed to spawn, Caber is probably my better play here for the last round. Plus, he has not got that many cards in one row. Now, annoyingly, had I not actually played Ayuela, Radagast on the back row could have been a good play because I have 4 Gorillas on the back row and they would have all gained +4, which is 16. Whereas as it stands, I'm going to play Caber. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Saying that, actually 6 times 3 for 18. Caber does still give me the better buff, but had I not managed to get as many, more Gorillas on the front, Radagast would have been the better play. But yeah, Caber is definitely the best play here to buff all of the Gorillas I've got. Let's hope he doesn't have a way of destroying all of these. No, it doesn't look like he does. So now that we have watched those games, I just want to give my final closing thoughts on the human cards in general. I already know this is going to be quite a long video because there were a lot of human cards I had to discuss at the start. So if you have watched this far, thank you for watching to the end. My closing thoughts on the human cards are that, most of them you start unlocking fairly early on, and certainly if you are going the route of the Guerilla playstyle, that is, you can start doing that playstyle when you get to round 10. In my opinion, I would say it is probably a weaker playstyle than using the Fallen, just because Caber's ability only buffs Guerilla units, and if you've played a really good hand, you maybe have 5 or 6 of them on your deck, but you probably only have 3, maybe 4, if you're lucky. So it's not that big of a bonus, whereas someone like Vanuk will buff all of your Fallen, which is just a stronger effect. However, if you have not got Vanuk, if you missed him in the store and he's not yet been available for sale again, then this is certainly an alternative playstyle. However, as I did mention at the very start of the video, there are a lot of cards, human cards, and even non-human cards, but they show up in this filter, which do not have anything to do with this playstyle. So I think humans are probably cards that you can include in builds with other races. I say you already saw me include Ayuela in my Fallen build, because some human cards just have very niche effects that are more one-off effects rather than being part of a single play style. So feel free to incorporate some human cards in your decks with other races if if there is a need to have that particular effect in your deck. I also think most of the exotic cards are classed as human, with the exception of the race-specific ones like Vanuk or the Witch for the Hive, which is why there were just so many more cards to discuss in this video. And again, the exotic cards, with the exception of Kaber, and with the exception of I was going to say Saladin, but actually Saladin himself isn't even to do with gorillas, it's humans in general. But with the exception of those two, all of the other exotic cards aren't even human specific. You could use them in any deck for the particular effect they give. So I guess my closing advice is, whatever deck you are building, if you are building a fully human deck or in the Guerilla playstyle, that is good, and it certainly has a place. But don't be afraid to incorporate human cards, especially exotic ones or legendary and mythic ones that have a particular effect in your decks with other cards of other races, just to get the most out of their abilities. So thank you for watching this far, and I